Well, hello, everybody. I just wanted to welcome you to another edition of our Tuesday Talk series. Today, we have Michael Raczkowski with Highland Capital Management, who will be speaking up to us today as we wrap up the year, looking back a little bit on some of the things that have happened, as well as opportunities to plan for the future. Mike was speaking to us all the way from Boston today, and he'll be available for questions. We can raise questions during the talk, or we can follow up at the very end. But without further ado, because I've seen the slide deck, I know there's a lot to cover, I'd like to introduce Mike. Welcome, Mike.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. As I said, as David said, my name is Mike Raczkowski. I'm an advanced planning attorney at Highland Capital Brokerage. So I do always have to start with a little disclaimer of, this is not legal or tax advice, and you need to talk to your own attorney and tax advisor and all that kind of fun stuff. But basically what I do is I help draw it on the chalkboard, the plans and, things that you might be looking to implement, answer questions that may come up. And I tend to be a little different from a lot of the other attorney geeks out there in the industry, because I really do a lot of dive into a lot of data that brings to mind my thesis that everybody should be doing some sort of planning. So we're probably never going to actually have more favorable conditions for doing your financial planning and estate planning than what we have right now. So what I'm starting with is just kind of as an agenda item is we'll talk a little bit about the election that we just had. I don't mean to belabor the point. In fact, frankly, I think there's a couple districts in California that are still counting votes. But for the most part, it is now in the history books and we can move on from it. But the big thing is, what is the impact? What's it going to mean for the near term and then maybe for a little bit further out? We'll chat briefly about what's going to happen in 2023, kind of what's on the to-do list. Those are the things that Congress and policymakers should ultimately deal with. And then there's some that they have to, and there's some that they'll probably punt off into the future. There's something underway already that's called the Great Transfer. So I'll touch base upon that a little bit, along with some details on the silver tsunami, and then ultimately a little bit of planning opportunities, and then we'll just follow up with some questions. So what the election really is going to mean from a planning standpoint is gridlock. And to a degree, I think that's actually what Washington or what Wall Street wanted out of the election was gridlock. Harder to get anything done unless it's very bipartisan. So, we're not going to see 51 votes in the Senate for many things because it won't get through the House if it's only getting 51 votes in the Senate. The thing that means selfishly in our industry is that means that the current estate and gift tax credit, which is often referred to as the unified credit. They call it that because years ago, it used to be estate credit tax and gift tax were kind of two separate, and then they unified them into one number. Makes it a lot easier for everybody. But that number is extremely high right now. It's $12,060,000, going to go up again on January 1st to $12.9 million. That's one little area where inflation actually helped people out. But it's going to stay there until about December 31st of 2025 under current law. And then it's going to drop by half. So that's one of the conditions that goes into my theory that planning conditions are probably never going to be likely more favorable in the future than what we have right now. I also think as a result of the election, because it wasn't very strongly one way or the other, it was sort of the way I sometimes describe it, it was like the old line from Shakespeare, a plague on both your houses. It was sort of like we don't want either side to win. We just don't want. So as a result, I think what we're going to end up dealing with is the Fed is going to continue to remain the field general. They're going to be in charge of the battle against inflation. I don't think we can expect much from a policymaker standpoint that's going to try and help or anything on that front. We're not seeing anything just being discussed policy-wise about austerity. You remember that was sort of a buzzword maybe a dozen years ago or so. There was tons of articles during that Tea Party period of austerity and reining in spending and things like that. That seems to have been tossed by the wayside. Nobody's paying any attention to that. We're not seeing any discussion of balancing the budget. We're not even seeing anything about the Fed making a pivot from a more hawkish position to a more dovish and accommodating, meaning lower interest rates. And I think that's not going to happen until inflation comes down. There's some kick the can items I will touch upon a little bit. Those are going to seem like they're not going to get addressed. Nobody in Congress seems to have any appetite for doing that until they have to. And so that's sort of one of those where we know there's going to be hard votes there. So let's let the next Congress or the next Congress after that or the next Congress after that deal with it. And lastly, all of this comes down to, I think interest rates are probably going to remain higher for longer, at least into 2023. But I do believe that the Fed has no choice but to push interest rates back down in the future. What it really comes down to is we can't afford a $30 trillion debt at 5 or 6% interest. We can afford it at 1%. We can't afford it at 5 or 6. So as they might let them go up and maintain higher for 2023, but at some point they're going to have no choice but to quash them back down. I also think underlying all of that is the calendar. Once 2024 hits, the Fed isn't going to want to look like they're putting a thumb on the scale one way or the other. They're going to want to look like they're being very agnostic from a policy standpoint. So I think 23 could be a little bit of a free for all. There may even be a few surprise hikes from the Fed that are maybe larger than is anticipated in order to get inflation under control so that they can avoid that 2024, and trying to interfere in anything in there. So what it comes down to on 23 for the to-do list, Secure Act 2.0 is an act that passed the House 414 to 5. And so they're still trying to get it through the Senate. I just think with 2 weeks left, I just don't see that that's going to happen. So that may come back to the surface in 2023. Basically, what it was to try and improve retirement readiness, clear up some things related to retirement planning, some questions about IRAs, how those work as legacy assets, even change some provisions that would make it more favorable to sell annuities, particularly income annuities using your retirement planning. Q1, we're going to have the debt ceiling up. So we'll have that whole brinksmanship thing that they get once every, couple of years where we're going to, go right down to the wire of will they or won't they. And eventually people in Congress are going to have to hold their nose and make an ugly vote and basically choose to increase the limit on the credit card. That's pretty much what it comes down to. There was some discussion to kick it beyond 24. There was a little discussion that the Democrats were going to try and do that during the lame duck session of just pass it through both houses and take that off the table at least through the end of 2024. There's been nothing on that. So I think that's pretty much off the table. Still a lot of rumors that Treasury Secretary Yellen's probably going to be out in Q1. And if that does happen, that is going to be an extremely ugly nomination battle, because what will happen is you'll have, of course, the Republicans using that as a means of attacking the administration for their economic policies. You'll also have some of the more progressive Democrats probably using that as a means of testing out their own campaign themes, because behind the scenes, everybody is still thinking that they're going to be the ones running as the nominee in 2024 and that the president is going to have stepped aside by then. The president may not agree with that, but everybody else seems to. A couple wild cards, watch for immigration policy. Obviously, we all know they need to do something on that one, but it seems like there's no appetite until the last couple of weeks. Senator Sinema from Arizona and Senator Tillis from North Carolina have both kind of come out with, and he's pretty conservative, she's pretty liberal, have come out with sort of a policy of maybe finding a way to split the difference there on immigration policy. That will actually be very favorable for us from the silver tsunami standpoint. We need more young people and we need more people who work and pay taxes. So, watch for energy policy, and then, of course, war. And then lastly, the 2023 to-do list. It's already kicked off, but we're already into the, 2024 presidential campaign. So it seems like, didn't we just suffer through one of those? Do we have to do it again? But apparently we do. So Secure Act 2.0, these are a couple of the provisions that they were talking about in the bill. These aren't law yet, but they're just some things to be aware of. They're basically designed for working age folks and to try and improve retirement readiness for them, expanding automatic enrollment in 401ks. Their logic is if we make you do it automatically, you're probably not likely to actually proactively go fill out a form to say, I don't want to do that. So that's sort of their logic on that. They would also expand Roth options. For a lot of us, Roth options weren't available until we were well into our working years. And for a number of years, even most of your companies didn't offer Roth options or Roth 401ks. So it's all kind of a relatively recent phenomenon there. But Congress likes them because they produce tax revenue today, not in the future. Your IRA produces tax revenue for them down the road when you take it out. They want the revenue today. So there's a lot of provisions in it to expand the Roth options specifically to generate revenue today. A few of the other things that they really emphasized was to remove barriers that currently exist for selling income annuities. That's an annuity that will pay you a guaranteed income for the rest of your life, and no matter how long you live. They're trying to take out some of the barriers that exist in current law to make that a more palatable option for people, essentially allowing you to turn your retirement savings easily into a pension for yourself. Same thing with increasing some options called qualified longevity annuity contracts, where you can set it up to produce it as a pension income for you using an income annuity, but down the road, maybe at 80, 85, 90, whatever age you choose. And those currently are very seldom sold. So it's one of those where they're trying to encourage more of that sort of product and option for it. So it'll be interesting to see if they can get it through. I think it's unlikely in the lame duck session. And then once we're into January, especially if Secretary Yellen retires, then you're dealing with that. You're dealing with debt ceiling. You got a lot of those headaches going on. So it may not even happen until maybe the tail end of 23. But you could see it happening in the second half of 23 because all of those people in Congress are going to want to be able to say, particularly if they're trying to run for president, look, we could do this bipartisan agreement. We understand. We listened, for what it's worth. So in terms of the kick the can items, Social Security and Medicare are currently the number one drivers of the federal deficit. It's hard to believe. It's not the Defense Department. It's actually those two. So there's a structural imbalance where the revenue that's generated by them will never exceed the expenditures or even meet the expenditures that are to be made on them. So needless to say, that's a real problem. And we're talking a problem of tens of trillions of dollars over the next 20, 30, 40 years. So given that, nobody seems to be addressing that or wants to. Nobody has the appetite. And it's kind of a case where politically, sort of like when I take my dog for a walk and, I have to clean up after her. And so, you hold the little bag and you look down and you try and figure out what's the clean ends that you can pick it up by. It's that's essentially what that sort of a problem is that they have to figure out Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Those are the drivers, and nobody wants to have an appetite or a discussion about it. Interest expense, as interest rates go up, this is actually driving, the newest, biggest government program. We're already on path to pay more in interest expense than we will be spending on national defense by the end of this decade. And that's without a spike in interest rates. So the silver tsunami, as I mentioned briefly at the beginning, is the graying of the American population. And what that means is we have a wave of where we're going to have more people over 65 than we have kids under 18 in just 2034. So just a few years down the road, we're going to have, the population over 85 is going to double by 2035 and then triple by the middle of the century. So you've got this real problem where policy response hasn't been equipped there to respond to that, creating more infrastructure, support services, dealing with the fact that the programs are underfunded for taking care of everybody, stuff like that. And then, of course, the last question is, with all of these deficits and as large as they are, who will buy all of those bonds if it's not the Federal Reserve just monetizing debt? So the great wealth transfer all plays into this because ultimately everything that you've accumulated, the IRS calls that your taxable estate, unless you've given it away in some means. So with all of the estate taxes and all of the discussion about that, last year in 2021, about $2 trillion went from generation 1 to generation 2 across the country. And the IRS collected a grand total of about 1% of that amount as estate taxes, $23 billion. Now, selfishly, I like to think that means people like Kyle and David and myself are doing a really good job. And, we're helping people pass their estates to their families tax-free. But, when you're being more objective about it, if the projections by some of the industry think tanks like Cerulli Associates are, we're going to have a $68 to $84 trillion, wealth transfer over the next 25 years, it just seems unlikely to think that with all of the spending and all of the other problems that they're going on there, that we're going to see that much wealth go without significant taxes in the future. In fact, if you look at this chart, what I did on this one was I actually went back to 1985, when Back to the Future came out, and I created this chart here and I indexed it to $2022. So you can see that the estate tax exemption, that's the amount you can accumulate as much as you want in your cup of coffee. But there's only so much the IRS lets you pour out before they start coming for 40% of everything over that. So the estate tax exemption for the longest time was really flat in real dollars. And then it had a big jump up in 2009, big jump up in 2017 or 2018. And now it's scheduled to drop by half on January 1 of 2026. So with that, and then the backdrop of transfers going from generation 1 to generation 2 going up in the trillions of dollars each year, it just seems unlikely that those benefits are going to continue to happen and that they're going to be as generous on the amount that you can accumulate in your coffee cup and how much you can give to your next generation before they take their 40%. Kind of one of those unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. So the estate tax exemption is scheduled to be, as a result of increases, and it's scheduled to keep increasing for the next couple of years. But as a result of that, very few people actually pay estate taxes. It was 1,275 taxable estate tax returns received in 2021, excuse me. So given that number is really small, and then most of the benefit goes to the high net worth and ultra high net worth, you could see why ultimately someone in Washington is going to buy a calculator and start, like the old Willie Sutton line, they're going to go where the money is. But that's against that backdrop of, as I described, the silver tsunami. And this is really about preparedness for future plans for all of us, for longevity planning. So by 85, the 85 plus population will double by 2035. This is from the baseline of 2010, and then it'll triple by 2060. And then, of course, currently there's a real age disparity that's leading to a more significant impact on women than it is on men. Because 65 to 84, there's 81 men for every 100 women. 85 plus, there's 56 men for every 100 women. So for the single guys who are 85, they could have a different date every day of the week, which is really favorable for them. But it's one of those where the pressure this is going to put on policy and, kind of the policy response. So like if we take a look here, it's a little hard to tell, but these are children 18 and under. And that line is ever so slightly increasing all the way through mid-century. It's actually a good thing that it's increasing because there's a lot of our fellow, developed societies like Japan, China, places like Russia is actually having a depopulation problem, where all of these countries are actually starting to shrink because their population aged, they're outside of childbearing years, they're not having more kids, and so now they're starting to shrink. Japan, by the end of the century, will have fewer people than they had in 1950. Crazy. So we're at least growing. But then this is the working age, kind of the middle ground here in green. And you can see that's still growing a little bit as well. But it's this bar here, this blue bar, where we're seeing that growth of 65 plus. So it's, that group continuing to grow. And they're the ones, of course, reliant on programs that they've been promised over all these years. So, the fact that nobody's talking about it from a policy response of shoring them up and trying to make sure that those are going to be there is really very frustrating to me. But if you look, the population growth 65 plus, you can see kind of tapering off on the 65 to 84 by about 2030. That's for women up top, men in the, is the next bar down. But down at the bottom, you look at the 85 plus, you can see that, that's starting to just take off there. And so it's going from about 4 million people today to 12 by 2050. And that's just where, unfortunately, that's where more of the care need is. And so this is where it comes to being prepared for longevity is going to also involve sometimes awkward discussions or uncomfortable discussions about what are the plans for care when somebody does need some assistance. And unfortunately, the stats they're awful. So I'm just going to give them to you, Frank, and just tell you how it is. So it's 42% of people over age 85 need some sort of care. 58% of women over 65 will need some form of care at some point in their lifetime. While 10% of Americans over 65 have dementia, that number balloons to almost 4 in 10 when you hit 85 plus. And the average life expectancy, of someone when they have a dementia diagnosis is 8 to 10 years. So there could be a lot of people who live very long with that condition. And it doesn't seem like there's a miracle cure on the horizon. So against that, there's the whole economic backdrop. And this sounds like I'm really cynical or really negative about everything. I actually really believe that long term, what will happen is it'll kind of get to a point where it feels like a real crisis bubbling to the surface. And then people from across the spectrum are going to come together and say, okay, we need to figure this out and sort through it. But it's one of those where it's going to sort of take having your hand pressed down on a hot stove before anybody actually does that. So when we look at it, just over the next 10 years, you can see the orange bar is what we're going to spend, and the green bar is what they're projecting in revenue. So over the next 10 years alone, we're looking at another $14.5 trillion of spending. And I do like to joke, when I was a kid, $1 trillion was a lot of money, and Pluto was a planet. So, we've kind of gone wrong on both of those counts. But when you look at it, it's just continuing. And at the same time, one of the biggest drivers of that is interest expense. For the longest time, the deficit was going up each and every year. This is the mid 90s right here. And you can see that the actual amount we're spending on interest was going down because the interest rates were doing this for so long. Unfortunately, for a lot of you, that kind of really hurt as well from a retirement savings standpoint. You had money in the bank and you couldn't get 1% on CDs. You had, after 5,000 years of being paid for putting your money in the bank, that just disappeared in the last 15 years. So now that we're all of a sudden in an environment where there is some yield and some positive interest rates, that's been great and really a welcome development, except, the development right here when you can see the spike in interest expense on the national debt. So when it comes down to it, this all brings, as I mentioned at the beginning, great planning opportunities for everybody. And so one of the top things that we're seeing is why pay taxes on money you aren't using. We'll also talk a little bit about getting money off the sidelines. And I'll explain kind of what I mean about that. the income backfill, and then tsunami solutions, and kind of go through all of those. But when it comes down to why pay taxes on money you aren't using, so they kind of let us have a glimpse behind the curtain. The IRS actually releases really good data on estate tax returns. And that tells us what high net worth people own and sort of what asset classes they have. It actually broke down like 30 asset classes, closely held business, artworks, collectibles, like, everything. I just concentrated on like the normal ones for the purposes of my analysis. And the thing is, in that of the high net worth individuals, it's roughly 10% of their assets are held as tax-free muni bonds. Now, I'll admit I got a little bit of gel in my hair, so it's kind of locked into place. It doesn't move very easily. But the rate of return on tax-free muni bonds is about maybe 2.5%. So it's not exactly blowing your hair back and getting anybody excited. Even 2.5% tax-free, unless you got a ton in there, it's not really exciting. But the reason is, why pay taxes on money I'm not using? So if you're sitting there and you got kind of an idle position, that's why inevitably that high net worth individual has moved their money into munis is, well, not using it, got no plans for it. What else am I going to do? I don't want to pay taxes on it. That's their solution. So some of the options there that might make sense for your normal everyday planning considerations, what we call linked benefits. And there's been kind of a renaissance on the linked benefit products. Those are products that are really, they are technically life insurance, but they're really long-term care based. They're designed to provide care, at home, in a facility, adult daycare, home health aid, whatever it is. They're designed to provide that. And so they have very little death benefit, but very robust long-term care benefits. Those are great options because you can move your money into it and you don't have to pay taxes on it because it's tax deferred. If you receive the benefits, those are also come back to you tax-free. And then, of course, if you don't use it, your family gets a tax-free benefit when you're gone. So it really checks a lot of boxes from a planning standpoint. And it's probably going to be more efficient on your balance sheet than the 2%, blowing your hair back with the tax-free muni bonds. Similarly, we're seeing a lot of people start to take advantage of the irrevocable life insurance trust or just irrevocable trusts in general. The idea is that if the IRS is coming for everything in my coffee cup when I'm gone, and they could change the amount, like it's going up each year right now, and my cup is getting bigger each year, but eventually it's going to drop down. I can take some of that coffee out now. I could pour it into a different vehicle, like a separate pitcher. That's my trust. And if it's set up right, it's outside of my taxable estate, like the Heisman here. It is at arm's length. I can't touch it, but it's for my kids, my grandkids, my great grandkids, my spouse, whoever I want, maybe even a little charity, whatever. But either way, you can set it up in there. And the nice thing is it's offering tax deferral. It could have an income and possibly a state tax-free death benefit. So you can just by moving a little bit over there, it positions it very nicely. Similarly, we're seeing a lot of movement into the annuity market space because the rates of return have gone up significantly since the first of the year. I'm on pretty much a distribution list from just about every annuity carrier out there. So I get an email pretty much daily saying, hey, good news, rates are up again. Good news, rates are up again. So that's been a really favorable alternative because even though you have to pay taxes on the money when it comes out, you might be getting 5 or 6% instead of 2%, and it's tax deferred until you take it out. So if you never use it, that's fine. Leave it to your kids. They can pay the taxes when they take it out. And then also we're seeing people start to redeploy large idle cash positions because if you have something beyond your emergency fund, if you have the bucket of money you've got set aside that if you need a new roof, if your furnace goes, if your transmission needs to be replaced, time to buy a new car, help Junior with the down payment on his college, whatever, all of those things, and you got that, and that bucket is full. Anything else you have in there is, beyond emergency funds, is just losing money right now to inflation. So, it's losing buying power. So as a result, why not redeploy it somewhere where it fits some of the other planning objectives? So when we look at those assets, and I said, the IRS gave us like 30 boxes of categories here for high net worth individuals. But you take a look, the one that was really noteworthy to me was for estates of 10 to 20 million, they averaged $2 million in muni bonds. For estates of 20 to 50 million, they averaged $5 million in muni bonds. Again, it's not the rate of return. It's the why pay taxes on money I'm not using. So I think there's a real planning opportunity there for all of us. Doesn't matter what the net worth is, to just look at, what, I've got some money that's sitting around, it's idle. I should probably check the box on filling some of my planning objectives, particularly where when you look at all the spending and you look at all the deficits and you look at the, that transfers that are going underway already, it just, seems likely that those assets have a bullseye on them anyway. So why not try and deploy them somewhere over there where they're protected for my kids? Sometimes they protect your kids from themselves too, if you set up the trust the right way. So similarly, the sideline money, oops, I'm sorry, my slide, the average money market rate, I don't know why the number is inaccurate there. It should actually be 2.3% was the average September rate, money market rate, which if a year ago you had asked me, everybody would have been thrilled with having 2% on their money market rate. And then, yet now with inflation at 7.1, nobody feels thrilled with that. Same thing with the 12-month CD was 3.5. And so if you look at it, that again, you would have a year ago been absolutely thrilled with that rate. And yet 12 months later, for whatever reason, we're not thrilled with it, because even if we have a $100,000 CD sitting there at the bank earning 3%, you're getting taxed on the 3% and you're losing 7% to inflation. So you're really losing 4% overall in buying power on the money that you've got sitting there. Not really a good position. It's not a position anybody feels favorable or optimistic about. Actually is really driving a very negative sentiment in the marketplace. As I mentioned, the average muni bond rate's 2% for a general obligation bond over the next 10 years. Now, you might be able to get something today that's a bit higher than that, 2.5, 2.75, something like that. Great. But it's still one of those where it's a tax-free return, but it's one of those where you're not really keeping up with, again, the lost buying power to inflation. So what we see people do with these idle assets that are beyond what you need for the in case of glass break, emergency, linked benefits, those long-term care options, we see that. We see short or single paid trust-owned second to die life insurance. There's been a lot of product repricing there. That's been a very favorable rate of return. And if you put it into a trust for the kids, you can control the terms that will pour the coffee out of that based on what you want. So it could be income only. It could be, based on a certain age. It could be, everything else. You can work with your estate planning practitioner to come up with that. So I think all of that's been very favorable. Similarly, when we look at it, kind of the income picture over the last couple of years, for the longest time, inflation had been so flat that Federal Reserve was, sort of famous last words, be careful what you wish for. They were complaining that they couldn't get it to 2%. And then now all of a sudden it went a little above 2% on a transitory basis. And then sure enough, here it is. This is just the impact of inflation eating away at a $100 bill over the course of the last couple of years. And if you, for the longest time, you started over here at $100, a monthly income, or, 1,000, 10,000, whatever that number is for you. But you can see how, for a long stretch, you were fine. You weren't even feeling the impact. It hadn't lost its buying power. And then all of a sudden 2021 hit, and you can see it kind of fell right off a cliff right here. And then all of a sudden, you went from, feeling like 90 cents on the dollar down to 80 cents on the dollar very quickly. This chart's only through July, so it's actually probably more like 76 cents on the dollar or something like that right now. So that's one of those where we frequently see people using an option like an annuity to backfill for that. So if you feel like you've had that erosion in your buying power, that's a great option. Also, similarly, if somebody has already set up some life insurance to be sort of a legacy asset for their kids and grandkids, frequently they'll now look at it and go, geez, that, we bought $1 million. Doesn't seem like enough. We maybe need to bump it up and buy another 250 or another 500, just so that we can make sure that our legacy goals there are taken care of. Similarly, as I talked about with the silver tsunami and kind of the wave that we're already in the middle of. So if you're worried about long-term care or longevity, there's really never been a better time for, tsunami solutions, that are products that offer benefits to take care of those care concerns. Life insurance with long-term care riders, chronic care riders, critical care riders. Not all of those are made the same, but we do have resources to help kind of like identify which one is more favorable for your particular circumstance. Linked benefit solutions, I mentioned those previously. Those are the more, it's technically life insurance, but it's really a long-term care is what you're really buying there. Traditional long-term care is still available, but kind of seldom sold, to be honest. There's sometimes annuities with living benefits that can help pay out maybe more rapidly, or enhanced benefits for when long-term care needs should they come up. And then also we're even seeing clients ladder deferred income annuities for real longevity. So, I've been to the birthday party for a 102-year-old. So, when you see that, you kind of think a little differently about longevity than you do, in other circumstances. So that's one where you can actually set up an annuity that'll kick in income when you hit 80, then maybe another one at 85. But because that's a time period out a while, you get a really nice income benefit on that because, there's some vagaries of life, but it does provide a lot of peace of mind. And then finally, we'll chat a little bit about the overly qualified. So this is essentially, if you have most of your assets are IRA or 401k assets, those are, you've done a great job saving, you're feeling really comfortable. A lot of times we run into the client who then says, well, I kind of don't want to take the money out. I don't want the RMD, the amount that the Uncle Sam makes me take out. I don't need it. That's more than I want. What do I do? Well, unfortunately, Uncle Sam is going to want their share. So the thing is that we do see circumstances like that where sometimes people will borrow a little extra out of there, take a little extra out of their account each year and redeploy that into a trust, buy life insurance. So take some money out of a taxable account, turn it into something that's untaxable because it's income and estate tax free, and for life insurance is properly structured in a trust outside of your estate. And then what do they do that just essentially to kind of wash the taxes out of there. Particularly if you end up with the unneeded or unwanted required minimum distribution. Similarly, we see beneficiary protection. Sometimes people do it because now with the Secure Act 1.0, which is already law, I told you they're working on 2.0. But with Secure Act 1.0, if you leave an IRA to your children, they have no choice but to cash the whole thing out within 10 years. And that doesn't mean if it's an ideal scenario for them to cash it out over the next 10 years, doesn't matter. They have 10 years. So there's certainly been a lot of talk about trying to clean that up and simplify it, but nobody in Congress seems to have heard any of those conversations. So they keep also adding additional complicating factors. Like, for example, if one person inherits an IRA from their mom who was 71 and they inherit one from their dad who was 73, they have to take money out each of those first 9 years out of that 10 years, no matter what, from dads. But for moms, they don't, because now the IRS just keeps adding more rules to make it more and more complicated. In that scenario, it's because somebody died before they were, at the required minimum distribution age. So we do see sometimes people also take that where, given that the tax rates have been pretty static for a long time, and with the spending problems that's going on, they sometimes will look at it and say, I should take a little extra out of there right now while I know what my tax rate is, or what my tax rate is 22%. It's pretty manageable. Use that to buy the long-term care needs that we have to take care of that. So kind of for the tsunami solution. And then, for some people, even we'll see them a bit younger, typically more my age to, into your 50s, will maybe start, if they're maxing out and they're doing really well in their qualified plan, they may then start turning to other alternatives like cash accumulation inside of a life insurance policy because it's got very favorable tax benefits. So I know there was kind of a lot there. So we'll just I'll pause, take a sip of my coffee, and then open it up if we have any questions or anything like that.
Well, I just wanted to say a quick wow. You really covered a lot of material in a brief period of time. I think we all needed to catch our breath a bit.
I need to catch my breath. So.
I guess I just wanted to comment with all the different aspects covered, today. Oftentimes, first step would be, talking with your spouse, trying to decide what to do, talking with your financial advisor. Mm-hmm. But often I go out on calls with my clients to the estate planning lawyers to hear their ideas and trying to work out designs. And I just encourage folks to keep us involved in those discussions, because when we're there at the birth of the idea of what people are trying to do, it makes it a lot easier when we're trying to implement and trying to follow through and make sure beneficiaries are up to date.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
And, that's one of those things like I tried to, discuss with everybody, that's why you want to have your three parties involved. Your attorney to discuss the legal side, your tax advisor that's going to know the tax code, and then the investment side. So you need to have all three involved in that. And that's why David goes with clients. I also go with clients to the attorney's office, and same with Lindsay. I know that she does that. So, it's very important to incorporate three. So is anybody have a question regarding, what we covered, politics, planning, or portfolios? The reason why we're all chuckling is I am doing a video on all three of those. That's coming out next week.
While people are formulating their questions, Mike, could I ask you to just touch on quickly how some of the gifting provisions, you can get things out of your estate and yet still maintain certain control? Could you kind of touch on
Absolutely.
that so people don't think that this is money they're separated from forever?
Absolutely. I do find a lot of times that's one of the biggest misconceptions about gifting is that there's a fear that if I give it away, what if I need it back? You know, something like that. So the probably the most common planning strategy that we see used today is referred to as the spousal lifetime access trust. And that's where I have an in case of emergency break glass kind of solution where I can gift something to my trust, let's say cash. I gift cash to the trust. And if I ever needed it in the future, the trustee can distribute it to my spouse for HEMS, which is a very broad standard. But HEMS means health, education, maintenance, and support. Pretty hard to figure many things that don't actually fall into that one of those four categories. So it's a great way where you can do the planning, get it in place. And then if God forbid something ever happened down the road, you'd at least have that option of kind of getting it back that way. And also we'll even see people set them up kind of as reciprocal, where I set up a spousal lifetime access trust for the benefit of my wife. She sets up one for the benefit of me. It does need to be a little carefully drafted by an attorney who's familiar with it, because there is a rule the IRS has implemented called the reciprocal trust doctrine. Basically says if we make identical trusts, they kind of feel like we didn't really create any trusts, so they'll sort of disregard the trust in that case. But there's a lot of well-drafted and well-experienced attorneys out there who can actually help draft them so that that's not a problem. Such as for mine, the remainder beneficiary after, if it goes to my wife and then my kids, but if they're gone, it all goes to charity to rescue dogs. Whereas my wife, then it goes to take care of her parents, and so we have it set up so that there is not necessarily mirror image provisions in there. But regardless, it's a great way of at least implementing some of the planning. The other thing is it puts us in the driver's seat so that if God forbid we're gone down the road, the beneficiaries are my kids, but it's set up so that it doesn't just give them a huge lump sum of money outright, because we have some fear. For example, my daughter is like, she's the delayed gratification. She's 7. She's an absolute angel. And she is the delayed gratification. She'll save her allowance for weeks before she goes and buys a toy. And whereas my son gets his, allowance and immediately is at the store getting Pokemon cards and then asking if he can borrow next week's allowance. So I don't think I want to trust him with $1 million of cash or, whatever that number is. I would much rather trust the trustee to be responsible for distributing money to him based on either a standard that I can put in there, like to support it, health, education, maintenance, and support, or just based on, if you earn this amount of money, the trust will distribute this amount of money. But if you, don't earn anything, the trust isn't giving you anything, stuff like that, so that we can make sure that we're protecting him and encouraging the right behavior. Also, statistically, one of my 2 kids is probably going to have a practice marriage. And so, protecting it from, in-laws and outlaws and other lowlifes also seems like a good strategy.
Lindsay, do you have anything?
I'm just soaking it all in.
Would you like to go ahead and wrap us up?
Sure. So thank you so much, Mike, for your time and for all the information. We have recorded today's session, so we will be sending that out to everyone so they can either rewatch or, take extra notes, or maybe watch something else they missed. Our next Tuesday talk is going to be on January 12th. Where we're going to be doing a quarterly and of course an annual review, and then an outlook for 2023. Thank you everyone for attending, and as usual, just reach out to either Kyle, David, myself, or Candace with any and all questions. And everyone have a very Merry Christmas and a happy and safe New Year.